The moon landing was one of humanity's greatest achievements, a moment when, for the first time, humans set foot on an alien world. It was one of the most watched events in history, with over 400,000 people coming together to make it happen. When the Apollo 11 astronauts returned safely, it wasn't just the United States that celebrated, the entire world did. People didn't say, "The US did it," they said, "We did it." Humanity had put men on the moon. All of this happened 55 years ago, with the sixth and final moon landing, Apollo 17, taking place 52 years ago. Since then, we've sent many robotic missions to the moon, but no humans. So why haven't we been back? How hard could it be to just rebuild the Saturn V rocket, gather a crew, and return to the moon? The fact that we haven't sent anyone to the moon in over 50 years has fueled conspiracy theories claiming we never went in the first place. If we can't figure it out now, how did we manage it in the 60s, with far less advanced technology? Some speculate that we lost the technology or simply forgot how to do it, while others claim we never went at all. Despite all the speculation, I've noticed there isn't a single popular video that clearly explains both how we got to the moon and why we haven't returned. That's what I'm here to do. Hopefully, this video will give you a clear understanding of why we haven't gone back to the moon. Spoiler. It's not because we forgot how, and it's not just about politics. It's much more complicated than that. But before we can talk about why we haven't returned, we need to address the people who think we never went in the first place. It's pointless to discuss going back if some believe we never left Earth. So first, let's discuss how we know for a fact that the moon landings did occur, because that's actually part of the reason we haven't gone back. Later on, I'll explain how the very fact that the moon landings were real plays into why we haven't returned. Now, people who deny the moon landings aren't stupid. It's normal to question what the government says, and honestly, that's probably a good thing. Skepticism about government claims is entirely justified. But in this case, there's overwhelming proof that the moon landings happened, and much of it doesn't come from the US government. Satellites from India, China, and Japan have all taken pictures of the Apollo landing sites. They confirm the presence of the landers, the flags, the experiments, and even the astronauts' footprints. China and the US are rivals, so China has no reason to help America maintain a lie about the moon landings. In fact, exposing a fake landing would benefit China. But they didn't do that because their satellites showed that the landings were real. That alone should be enough to prove the moon landings happened. But if you're not convinced, there's even more evidence. Japan's Kaguya satellite mapped the moon in 3 dimensions, something we couldn't do back in the 60s or 70s. Before Kaguya, we had only a vague idea of what the moon's terrain looked like. But the landing site of Apollo 15 matches Kaguya's data perfectly, which is something NASA could not have known in advance. The fact that the Apollo 15 landing site matches modern data that NASA had no way of predicting proves that Apollo 15, at the very least, did happen. Either that, or NASA can predict the future. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence comes from Soviet spies. During the Apollo program, hundreds of Soviet spies were inside NASA. These spies were highly trained and were tasked with gathering any evidence they could of a potential hoax. In the USSR, if these spies didn't do their jobs well, they faced severe punishment. Yet none of these highly trained agents found any evidence that the moon landings were going to be faked. They observed real rockets being built, real landers being tested, and astronauts being trained to land on the moon. If NASA went to all that trouble, why would they then fake the actual landing? In fact, given all the work involved, faking the moon landing would have been harder than just doing it for real. But there's more. Thousands of people all over the world independently picked up the Apollo moon landing broadcasts. These weren't government officials or NASA employees. They were regular people with radio equipment. If you had a receiver tuned to the right frequency, you could have picked up the signals yourself, directly from the moon. So even without government involvement, people across the globe were able to confirm that the broadcasts were real. Combined with the spy evidence and the satellite images, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that the moon landings were real. One common conspiracy theory asks, how did they get through the Van Allen belts? This idea assumes the belts are deadly and impassable. I'll cover the Van Allen belts in more detail in a separate video, but the short answer is that they're not deadly if you pass through them quickly, which is exactly what the Apollo missions did. Now that we've established that the moon landings did happen, let's talk about why we haven't gone back. Surprisingly, the reason has to do with Apollo itself. If the Apollo program had never happened, we might have a moon base by now. First, it's important to understand that we didn't lose the ability to go to the moon, nor did we forget how to build the Saturn V rocket. While we technically no longer have the capability to build a Saturn V, that's not because we forgot how. It's because the Saturn V is outdated, dangerous, and has been replaced by better technology. People often say we've lost the technology, but what they really mean is that we've moved on to more advanced systems. We don't make Saturn V rockets anymore for the same reason we don't make black and white TVs or WB-era fighter planes. They're obsolete. So if we have better rockets today, why don't we just make an Apollo 2.0? The answer is simple. No one in their right mind would ever attempt another Apollo. Apollo was reckless, expensive, and unsustainable. It's honestly a miracle that none of the Apollo missions ended in the deaths of astronauts. For example, the Saturn V rocket had about a 10% chance of exploding on launch, and Apollo 11 almost failed to land due to rough terrain. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning, twice. With a 14% failure rate, the Apollo program was far from safe. In today's world, those safety margins would be completely unacceptable. No space agency would approve a mission with such high risks. But the dangers weren't the only issue. Apollo was incredibly expensive. NASA's current annual budget is about $20 billion. To fund another Apollo-style program, NASA would need 10 years' worth of its entire budget. That would mean no new missions, no salaries, and no operations for a decade. No one would agree to that today. Back in the 60s, NASA had a much larger budget because the US was in a heated space race with the Soviet Union. But today, while we are in a low-key space race with China, the stakes and the funding are nowhere near what they were during the Cold War. Even if we could overcome the cost and safety issues, we still wouldn't do another Apollo because it was unsustainable. Apollo didn't make life better on Earth or generate any economic return. It was purely for prestige. Once the US beat the Soviet Union to the moon, there was no reason to keep the program going. If Apollo had continued indefinitely, it would have bankrupted NASA. The public lost interest in moon landings after the initial excitement, and there was no plan to establish a permanent presence on the moon. Apollo wasn't designed to build a moon base or advance space exploration. It was designed to win a political race. So when the race was won, the program was canceled. Going to the moon is a good idea, but Apollo wasn't the way to do it. Fast forward to today. We're trying to go back to the moon, but we want to do it better this time. The Artemis program is designed to return humans to the moon in a safer, more sustainable way. Instead of just sending astronauts for brief visits, Artemis aims to build a permanent moon base, similar to the International Space Station. The technology is new, the goals are different, and none of the people who worked on Apollo are still around. Because of these factors, progress has been slow, and there have been delays and budget overruns. However, we are getting closer. Artemis 1, an uncrewed test flight, has already taken place. Artemis 2, the first crewed flight, is scheduled to launch soon. China is also working on a manned moon mission, with a goal of landing before 2030. So to sum up, the reason we haven't returned to the moon is because Apollo was reckless, dangerous, expensive, and unsustainable. We've spent decades learning from Apollo's mistakes, and now we're working on doing it the right way. By 2030, we'll likely have humans back on the moon. And this time, we'll be there to stay. If anyone ever asks why we haven't been back to the moon, just show them this video. That's why. And if you enjoyed this, Check out the 10 hidden secrets of the solar system.